often accustomed to sort of creating categories of work around which we sort of organize resources, capacity, and talent. And so if you're sort of in the for-profit sector, your whole ambition is about maximizing profit and, little more. And this is one traditional way of thinking, and certainly in the generations that I grew up in thinking about the differences between the for-profit and not-for-profit. And traditionally, and I've worked in this field now for 30 years, that if you work in the not-for-profit sector, that you sort of access the social sector resources to address the ambitions that you're trying to achieve. But I think to set up an organization to be able to innovate, you have to be willing to work across those sectors, and you have to be willing to work across talent and attract talent that is not just coming from sort of a history of social sector work, but that may have deep experience in working in the for-profit or commercial or private sector. And we have to break down these kinds of walls between social sector, private sector, public sector, if we're going to face the big problems of the 21st century. And so that I think that kind of thinking is what allows organizations to be more innovative. If you think, hey, we're just a social sector organization, then we can't really use the tools of the for-profit or commercial sector to advance social sector aims. That's kind of traditional thinking, and that's sort of what I grew up in. That's sort of how it was done. And so if you wanted to be a businesswoman, then you kind of worked in the for-profit sector and didn't worry about ambitions in civil society or social sector, or vice versa. But what I think is great, and what I saw happening in the early 2000s, certainly across the Omidyar family and across the Omidyar group, was ways in which you break down those barriers and begin to recognize that business can be a force for good, or business is a force for good. Let's not say it can be, but it certainly is a force for good. And that individuals that increasingly that are working in a for-profit context really want to understand what's the purpose of profit. And so recognize that those barriers are sort of artificial, and that innovation is held back to the extent at which we allow those barriers to continue. There's two features of working capital that I think are the most interesting, and the first is working capital. It's one of the first that I know of. We don't know of other examples, but it's possible they're out there, obviously. But it's one of the first times that a private foundation is known to be the general partner in essentially a private equity fund, is what it is. Although we use various instruments in the foundation world to drive capital, but it's essentially a private equity fund with Humanity United as the general partner, and with several limited partners. And that in its own right is somewhat of an innovation, that you would anchor that kind of partnership within a foundation, is done intentionally, is done on purpose, because we don't want to further segregate ourselves, because it would be very easy as a foundation to kind of spin off working capital, and it would begin to operate outside the context or outside the broader sort of the richness, I guess, that you find within the organization. And so we made a fairly deliberate choice to keep working capital within Humanity United. And of course, there's legal structures that wrap around that, and regulatory requirements that wrap around that are right and appropriate. But it was important that it be embedded in the foundation. So that's the first feature that I think is really interesting. And within that, obviously, then we're using our capital to advance emerging technologies around creating more transparency into supply chains. And it's classic kind of. I mean, it's not. There are others out there that understand this private equity far more than I do, but the innovation was really the ways in which it's embedded within the foundation. But the second feature of working capital that I think perhaps is even more exciting than organizing essentially a private equity fund within a foundation is the ways in which the limited partners are made up and those individuals and those organizations that sit around that table. I think the value of working capital is actually far greater than the capital that is brought to bear. It's a tiny fund, all right, but it still brings a fair amount of capital to these emerging technologies and is important to some startups who are seeking technology around supply chain transparency. But what's far more important is how that limited partnership represents individuals and organizations that cut across the private sector or cut across philanthropic or social justice causes and issues. And what's important there for me is that we're creating the space and we're kind of creating the environment where our thinking isn't siloed within one kind of worldview, if you will, or one way of thinking about how we might address forced labor or slavery practices in supply chains. We're given, just naturally, we're given socially to think about sort of siloed views of what the solutions might be to address challenges of supply chains. And so if you're coming through the private sector, it might be kind of the issues of procurement or or siloed within maybe a sales department or an engineering or something of that fashion. If you come from more socially justice related organizations, you're thinking more about rights and public policy and issues that are embedded within that context. And what I think is great about working capital is you have limited partners that span that entire range from limited partners that have massive global supply chains, that have huge procurement challenges that they're facing. And so they bring insights into those challenges. But we also have folks that are really thinking about gender, are thinking about rights, are thinking about policy in the ways in which those that are running these massive global supply chains aren't thinking about when they wake up in the morning. They're just thinking about how to procure their products, at the second or the third or the fourth or the fifth level of that supply chain and how to be successful doing that. So I think having those partners together really is even a greater innovation than simply how the capital is deployed.